In the last episode, I showed how I carried the lines from my headstock out to my bridge shape in order to continue that design motif. I also discussed some design considerations that are specific to bridges. I showed how I trace out copies of that design and how I lay out the guitar's dimensions to locate the bridge and to locate the saddle slot within the bridge. I begin where we left off with locating the saddle slot. So next I'm going to tape this down and, I'm going to move this around and find a good place for it, a good place for this saddle, aesthetically and I guess sort of structurally in a way. And by structurally I mean, well, let's take a look at the old template here. It's very important, as I alluded to earlier, not to have the treble end of the slot too close to this edge, and on this design here it actually is pretty close to that edge. I would not want to be any closer than it is there. That's okay though. That's about 2/16 off of that edge, so that's about as close as you want to get. I actually like the saddle slot to be set just a little bit further away from that so I don't have to worry about it. So some things I'm going to do differently on this one. These are just two things that I've been wanting to do for a while with my new bridge design. However it turns out, these were two things that I really wanted to incorporate into it. And that is, one, making the saddle thicker so that it can be a fully compensated saddle. And then the other thing I want to do is, these marks here are for the pinholes. And you can see that they go in a straight line parallel to the front edge of the bridge, which is really not necessary. There's no reason why those holes need to be parallel to that front edge of the bridge. It actually would make more sense if those pinholes were parallel to the saddle slot, which of course, as we know by now, that saddle slot is tipped at an angle, so these pinholes should be tipped at an angle. That way we get the same bite, whether it's the treble E string or the low E string or one of these strings in the middle. You're going to get that same angle and the same amount of pressure down on the saddle, and therefore you'll get more of a balanced sound because you don't have a very shallow angle back here and a very steep angle back here. It just makes sense to have all those angles even. These very faint lines on the outside here, by the way, are for the E strings. All I did to get those was I measured down at the nut area, I measured 3/32 of an inch off from the fretboard ends, and that's just a general good rule of thumb for most guitars really, for the distance of those E strings off of the fretboard edge. And as you'll see in a moment here, marking out the locations of those E strings will be very useful in locating our bridge pinholes. So starting with the width of the saddle slot, I'm going to take a center finding ruler and line it up along my center line here with the center of that 3/32 of an inch saddle slot. Out those marks. Now I'm just completing this little round at the end. My saddle slot, by the way, is basically a half slot through, so it rounds over at one end, but it slots through on the other end, and it's kind of hard to imagine that, but if you you'll see at the end, or maybe not at the end of this video, but you'll see how this comes to fruition later on. I locate my new bridge design over the now wider saddle. Since there are no squared edges or even straight lines, I don't have to worry about making the bridge shape square to the guitar body's center line. I can tip the shape at any angle just so long as it looks good and the saddle slot doesn't get too close to the edge.
Oh, and I also need the ends of the bridge to cross over where my X-brace will lie. This is for structural reasons. I could always overlay my top bracing pattern to check this, but I know this new bridge is pretty lengthy and it's probably not going to be a problem. Now I trace out the saddle. And I trace the guitar body's center line onto the bridge so that I can always find that same orientation. Remember those lines for the outside E strings? Well, now I can use those to locate and mark my outside bridge pin holes. I'm marking these holes a ½ inch from the center line of the saddle. I connect the marks so that I now have a line that is parallel to the saddle. This way, as I mentioned earlier, my bridge pin holes will be parallel to the saddle. Using just a little bit of math and the caliper, I set the other bridge pin hole locations.